We last met in May, and things have changed a lot with the budget since then, and some of it detrimentally. So the budget was billed as A, they wanted to fill a black hole, and B, it was 20 billion pounds. So two problems with that. One, I don't think you can fill a black hole, and two, 20 billion pounds. It is a lot of money, but just to give you an idea, the government debt at the moment is about 2.8 trillion pounds. The interest on that is 86 billion pound a year. So 20 billion pounds, just to put it in context, is less than 3 months interest. The government have already said they're going to borrow 28 billion pounds extra each year for the life of the Parliament. So that's 140 billion pounds. And that's already been built into the debt markets. So the interest rates you're expecting will happen, but at a delayed time, because that's already built in there. So the problem with the government's got is the 2.8 trillion pound of debt is about 98.5% of GDP. This country has got low productivity and low growth. If you're raising 40 billion pounds, there's very few budgets that can increase productivity and growth by raising 40 billion pounds. And as most economists will tell you, the person that pays the money is not necessarily the one that's going to incur it. So what I mean by that is if you're raising 25 billion pounds for employers' national insurance, the employer, whilst they pay it, is not necessarily the one that's going to incur the debt. So the problem with that is, to give you an idea, there's an article in the paper at the weekend, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the largest firm of accountants, they reckon the additional employer's NI, which is going up from 13.8% to 15% next April, will cost them 40 million pounds extra. So what they're going to do? They're going to reduce staff and they're going to outsource more. So what that means is that's not good for UK jobs. So the problem they've got is if the Chancellor doesn't increase growth and productivity, my concern is they're going to come back for another bite of the cherry in the future for tax. And that's the problem. And so this, if you assume they're in for 5 years, this is just the start of it. Generally, any government will give you the bad news on day one as much as possible. Hopefully at the end of their parliament, they'll give you better news because they want to be elected. But on the basis that the debt is so high and raising by another 140 billion pounds, you're going to have some issues. Now, if we assume we're into this room is probably mainly interested in capital taxes. So when we were around in May, my plan for my clients was if they've got a pension, that pension fund generally, let's just assume it's £1 million. I say £1 million because the pensions cap was £1,073,100. In the last budget in March, Jeremy Hunt removed that cap, but that was free from inheritance tax. The advice we would give to a client is you put that in trust, but it's in a will trust already. You don't leave it to your spouse on the assumption they don't need the money. You leave it to the next generation, and there's no inheritance tax on that money. The person you leave it to, let's assume it's the children, they will pay income tax on drawdown. If you die before the age of 75 years, they won't even pay that. But if you died after that, they will just pay income tax on drawdown, which is fine because you've had tax relief on putting the money into the pension. However, now that pension is going to be taxed at 40% on death rates. Now let's assume that I've got an inheritance tax-free allowance of 325,000, which everyone has. You can then claim a resident nil rate band of up to another £175,000. The problem with that is if your estate is more than 2.35 million, and bearing in mind that pensions now a taxable estate, so some people lose that, you don't get the resident nil rate band. You don't also get it if you don't leave the house to your heirs, your principal private residence. So some people may only be left with 325,000 tax-free, and the question is, well, all this tax planning I've previously done, if my pension is £1 million, that's £1 million in my estate that's going to be subject to 40%. The other thing is, let's assume I've got a business, trading business, and this is the same if I've got a farm, because farms are agricultural property relief. If I've got a business that's a trading business, I'm going to claim business property relief, now business relief. That previously also was completely free from inheritance tax. So if I had £1 million pension prior to the budget, that was going to the kids. That would never be taxed under inheritance tax. if I had a business, let's say it's worth £6 million, that also would go to the kids. I wouldn't leave it to the wife, because whilst spousal transfers are free from inheritance tax, if I leave it to her, then A, she might not be able to get business property relief on it because she's not running the business, and B, I'm just increasing her inheritance tax problem. So you'd leave it out of your estate, but now that's limited to £1 million. And after the million, so say my business is worth 6 million, the first £1 million would be free from an inheritance tax. The other 5 million would be taxed at half the death rate. Half the death rate, 40% times 50%, is a 20%. So you may have seen in the papers a lot of the farmers said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give my farm, put it in a trust, and that'll sort it out. The trouble is, what you've got to bear in mind is, if you put it in a trust, you'll probably have it in a discretionary trust. And a discretionary trust, you're subject to a lifetime inheritance tax. And lifetime inheritance tax is also at 20%. So if I put my farm or my family business into a trust, I'm going to pay 20% inheritance tax. So what you've got to be aware of is you need to do your tax planning. So for the sake of argument, if I did have a £6 million business in my name, I wouldn't be worried about business property relief, whereas now I am, because there's only £1 million that's tax-free. So how about I put some shares in my wife's name, no capital gains between spouses, so she will also get £1 million BPR relief. So suddenly I've got £2 million. The other thing I could do is I might want to do a gift. Now you can get a holdover tax relief for capital gains tax, which means that I could give shares in a trading company to whoever I want that doesn't crystallise a capital gain. And that way I've divested my estate. So you need to think of how you're going to plan that as well. With pensions, if your pension is structured correctly, up to a maximum of 1,073,000, you can get 25% of that tax-free drawdown. So I could take out, in that scenario, £250,000, and as long as I give it to someone and live 7 years, that's completely out of my estate. With regards to the rest of the pension, you could say, well, that still leaves you £750,000, and you're going to have to pay 40% tax on that. Not necessarily, because I work full-time. So if I drew down a pension today and made a gift, it's a gift out of income, because I don't need that money. A gift out of income means I don't have to live 7 years. So what you need to do is, when you're structuring this, A, I would suggest you need to revisit your wills to make sure they're done properly. B, you need to plan your structures. So you could, for the sake of argument, think that one of the things we're doing is family investment companies. So what you might want to do is, if I had a pot of cash, I don't really want all that cash in my name, but conversely, I don't want to give it to the kids because they won't be able to run it properly. If you do a family investment company, which we're doing at the moment, I can put, say, the £10 million cash, I could put it in the company, but I could give them non-voting shares, and I could have voting shares, but my voting shares could only be, say, 5% of the company. But that means 95% is owned by the kids, 5% is owned by me, but I still run it because I've got the voting shares. So suddenly what I've done is I've divested my estate, and as long as I live 7 years, that £10 million is not going to be subject to 40% tax. But what you've actually done is divested your estate, still ran the company, still got control over it, still got the voting rights. But you can actually be in charge of it, and then the kids can actually, then as they get older, depending on their age, as they get older, they might want to get more involved in it. But you actually run it. So what you need to do is think of capital ways of restructuring your affairs, both from capital gains tax, inheritance tax. So when we met in May, the highest rate of capital gains tax was 24% for residential property, 20% for most other things, such as shares. From midnight on the budget day, 30th of October, it's gone up to 24% capital gains tax. So people in the room may have been concerned about the withdrawal of venture capital trusts and EIS schemes, because the government said that they were going to get withdrawn in 2025. However, they announced that that's now been extended by 10 years. So that means that VCT schemes and EIS schemes, you've now got the relief for another 10 years. So if I put in, let's say, £1 million, I can put £1 million in an EIS scheme, I can put £2 million if it's a knowledge-intensive company. But say I put £1 million in, I then get 30% of that 300,000 off my tax bill. If I keep those shares in that company for 3 years, I don't pay capital gains tax on exit. And after 2 years, they qualify for business property relief. So that will go in towards my £1 million. So when you structure your affairs, the capital taxes are really important. As I had a client that came to see me the day after budget day, he said, look, Chris, I've paid 45% tax all my life, and when I die, they want another 40%. So you need to ensure that with your capital assets, that you look after them. And with a bit of planning, it's not the end of the world, this. Whilst it's not brilliant, there are measures that you can take to try and mitigate the extra tax on pensions, the increase in capital gains tax, and the increase that you've got of 40% on BPR relief. So a lot of these things, you just need to sort of think a bit more, and I would also suggest that you revisit your wills, because that can have a very crucial effect. Don't just think that, oh, I won't pay inheritance tax, I'll leave it all to the wife. Because what you do then is you just increase her problem. And what you need to do is really take advantage of any reliefs that you've got. So upon my death, what I'd want to do is take advantage of the 1 million BPR relief by leaving that to someone not my wife, because I'm going to get spousal relief anyway if I die first. So by doing these extra reliefs and dotting them round, and if you can do it, then you could either use gift holdover relief, which means that you don't create a capital gain on transferring assets now, and also family investment companies. And by doing the correct share structure, what you'll find is that you can mitigate these things. There's a famous saying that says that the only people that pay inheritance tax are those people that distrust their children more than they distrust HM Revenue and Customs. So you just got to think how you're going to plan it. And you don't have to give it all away and lose complete control. But what you can do is make it work for you. But the best thing is you've got to start thinking about it now, because in some instances, the planning has got to be done at least 7 years before you die. And none of us know when we're going to die, so why not start thinking about the planning now? So I think the moral of the story is that we're all going to be affected by the changes in capital taxes, but just bear in mind, pre the budget, the papers were saying, well, the worst case scenario is they could increase capital gains tax to the same rate of income tax. Now, there is previous for this. Nigel Lawson in 1988 did exactly that. The highest rate of income tax was 40%, and he increased capital gains tax to 40%. However, a couple of governments later, in fact 20 years later, Gordon Brown took it down to 18%. So there are cycles in these things, and capital gains tax is only payable when you crystallise a gain. So if you don't have to crystallise it, you just carry knocking it forward, or you move it to another generation if you can claim gift holdover relief. So with a lot of this stuff, by taking the right advice, and I realise there's a lot to take in, but we do YouTube videos on it, so if you ever got a spare 90 seconds, there's a Wilkins Southworth YouTube probably on this, because we've done 8 of them after the budget. But there's something you can find in there, and then just explore it a bit more. Explore it with your advisor. If you want to ring us up, a free chat, we'll give you some more ideas. But the idea is plan. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. You've got to plan. Thank you.